I froze when I saw my wife leaving the company party through the back door with another man, her face filled with happiness. The music continued, but inside me there was only silence. I left soon after, without saying goodbye to anyone, ending everything I once believed to be love. "You didn't lose me today, you lost yourself," was all I could say when she looked at me, days later. The lover, who seemed right that night, disappeared at the first call. She was left alone, surrounded by the choices she made. I, over time, found a new love, sincere, peaceful, and whole. When she sought me out, repentant, I offered forgiveness. Not to return, but to close the cycle with dignity. She continues with the absence of what she destroyed, with the presence of what I rebuilt. I was there. Amid glasses, dimmed lights, and ambient music I've never been able to listen to without feeling nauseous again. I remember the taste of the wine she offered me before disappearing, her smile as she chatted with her colleagues, as if nothing else existed beyond her own reflection in the eyes of those who admired her. I watched her like someone watching something they love fall apart, powerless to intervene, and even though there was a choked scream inside me, what came was the most deafening silence of my life. My feet refused to move, as if they understood that what was coming next was the end. When I saw her exit through the back, laughing like she hadn't laughed with me in a long time, and beside a man who wasn't me, everything inside me froze. The world kept spinning, but inside me, everything had stopped. That night, I died in a way no one saw. There was no funeral, no candles lit. Just a man standing in the middle of the party, trying to understand when he stopped being enough for the woman he swore to love. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't run after her. I simply left the glass on the table, grabbed my coat, and left, like someone leaving a place they no longer belonged to. And while the party lights still shone, and conversations mingled with the sound of the music, I walked the streets with my soul dragging behind me. Because, yes, a part of me remained there, in that room, the part that still believed in her. She tried to explain it to me days later. She looked at me as if searching for forgiveness at the bottom of a self-dug abyss. "I was confused," she said. "It wasn't what you think." But what she didn't understand was that I was no longer thinking anything. I was feeling. And what I felt was an open cut, the kind that hurts more when no one sees it. "You didn't lose me today, you lost yourself." And that was it. There were no screams, no slamming doors. Just a truth that echoed between us like a sentence. She cried. I didn't. Because I had already cried everything I had in me that morning when I returned home alone and lay down on one side of the bed that felt bigger than ever. The pain didn't come all at once. It came in waves. Some nights I slept angry, others longing. There were days when I remembered us laughing on the couch, arguing over trivial things, texting each other during work hours like love-struck teenagers. There were days when I felt ridiculous for having believed so much. But the worst part wasn't what she did. It was everything she destroyed in me without realizing it. My confidence. My calm. My sense of worth. It took me months to understand that it wasn't me who was too little, it was her who was too empty to recognize how much she held in her hands. And it was on this path, between relapses and rebuildings, that I encountered the unexpected. Someone who didn't arrive to take her place, but to remind me that love still existed in the world, just different, light, mature. Someone who looked me in the eyes without needing promises. Who listened to me without interrupting. Who smiled at me as if at peace, not at stake. Over time, I understood that love doesn't die, it just changes address. And mine had finally found another home. While I was learning to love again, she sank into silences no one could hear. Friends drifted away, joy gave way to a permanent restlessness, and the man she thought was freedom became just another forgotten name in conversations no one wanted to hear anymore. But her true punishment came much later, when, unintentionally, or too willingly, she found a box I'd kept for years. And inside were the letters I'd written to her during our marriage. Never delivered. Heartfelt letters. Full of affection. Things a man only writes when he loves deeply. She read each one as if trying to turn back time with her eyes. She cried, they told me. She cried like someone who discovers, too late, what she's thrown away. She tried to get closer. She texted. She asked for coffee. She said she needed to look at me one more time. But what she didn't understand was that I was no longer there. The man she betrayed, the man she lost, the man she thought could come back, that man was in the past she herself destroyed. And I was with someone else now. Someone who didn't need to lose me to value me. Someone who didn't tempt fate or gamble with my heart. She asked me for forgiveness. And I gave it. Not to ease her pain, but to free myself from my own. I forgave because holding a grudge would mean remaining trapped in a story that was no longer mine. I forgave because forgiveness isn't an invitation back, it's a door that closes with dignity. She cried again. I held her hand for a second and said, I loved you. But this isn't yours anymore. And then I walked away. Without looking back. The story ends like so many others untold. A woman beset by bad choices. A man rebuilt by true love. And a past that will never return. But there's something no one knows yet, something that was in that box of letters, something she saw and never had the courage to tell. A detail, a sentence, a promise that could have changed everything, if it weren't too late. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal is not romance, it is ruin that we do not support, romanticize, or justify it. All the stories you hear are fictional, but inspired by emotional truths that many have already experienced. Our goal is clear, to show that betrayal doesn't just hurt, it destroys homes, trusts and entire futures. Get ready. What you're about to hear is a story. Shocking, intense and unforgettable. A lesson wrapped in drama. Take a deep breath. The truth will hurt. For many years, Daniel and Helena's love seemed to be the kind that life respects. They met as young people in a bookstore, when he, clumsily, dropped a stack of historical romances right at her feet. They laughed. They exchanged apologies. He noticed her watchful eyes watching him, as if she'd known him from another life. She, in turn, was intrigued by his restrained and sincere manner, like someone who walks the world carefully so as not to hurt anyone. Their subsequent encounters were simple and, therefore, unforgettable: coffees on rainy afternoons, movies watched in silence, hands that leisurely sought each other, conversations that stretched into the wee hours. It was a relationship made of small things, but one that possessed a grandeur that neither of them could explain. Over time, their coexistence shaped their rituals. Helena prepared breakfast every Sunday while Daniel read the newspaper headlines. He knew by heart her sleeping position and her preferred side of the pillow. She knew his silences like someone listening to a language of her own. Nothing between them was loud or excessive. They were two whole people living together in peace, and that was love. Helena was always intense. Ambitious in her gaze, elegant in her gestures, she possessed a discreet magnetism, the kind that doesn't impose itself, but is easily ignored. She worked in communications and knew how to use words with precision, whether in meetings or at social dinners. Daniel, more reserved, was a civil engineer and often said he preferred building bridges to giving speeches. Even so, between them, there was an unlikely balance that worked. She pushed him out of his comfort zone, and he reminded her of the value of silence and calm. Together, they built a life based on complicity, trips that marked chapters in their history, family parties, occasional arguments always overcome with dialogue. They were the kind of couple who seemed to have found the formula so many seek: love, respect, and a rare lightness. Their home reflected this care. Every corner held something of both. The bookshelf in the living room blended Daniel's technical books with Helena's dramatic novels. The kitchen, illuminated by the evening light, was the scene of laughter, impromptu dinners, and a few glasses of wine on the longest nights. The bedroom was a refuge, where bodies met with familiarity and desire still alive, even after years. On the walls were paintings of travels, saved notes, spontaneous photographs. Anyone who entered that home realized, without needing words, that there was history, routine, and affection there. Over time, life demanded more. More dedication to work, more commitments, more goals. Daniel began to take on projects that required long hours at the office and, sometimes, unexpected travel. Helena, on the other hand, began to gain visibility within the company where she worked and began to be invited to events, lectures, and social engagements. Still, they tried to stay connected. Scheduled lunches, midday messages, discreet surprises. But, as happens with many couples, the effort began to wear thin in the face of routine. Conversations became more objective, touches less frequent. There were no arguments, no accusations, just a subtle distancing, so slow it seemed imperceptible. A separation that didn't hurt immediately, but that gradually eroded what had once been a constant presence. Helena began to miss something she couldn't even name. She felt alone even with company, fulfilled by a functional life, but emotionally empty. Daniel, always centered, didn't realize the depth of this void. He believed they were simply going through a natural phase of maturation in their relationship, a time when love manifests itself more in actions than words. He still watched her sleep from time to time, still remembered how much she liked coffee, still worried when she arrived home too late. But perhaps he'd forgotten to tell her. Or perhaps he'd assumed she already knew. Friday dinners began to be cancelled out of fatigue, Sunday outings were swapped for naps, and the once vibrant intimacy began to be postponed for weeks. None of this seemed alarming to Daniel. He trusted her, the strength of their story, and what they had built together. He believed that, even in absence, their love remained. But for Helena, the silence began to weigh heavily. She missed being looked at with admiration, being touched with desire, being listened to without haste. Not by just anyone, but by him. Still, neither of them talked about it. And that was perhaps the most dangerous mistake, the silence that settles between two people who no longer know how to reach each other. The days became repetitive, as if they lived in cycles that no longer intersected. Dinners were now with friends, work trips were enjoyed with a certain relief, and the couple's bed became occupied by bodies sleeping back to back. There was still love there, but mixed with a kind of weariness that prevented them from expressing it. There was no betrayal, no open hurt, but a growing absence of presence. An invisible flaw that, over time, would become a crack. Amidst this scenario, Helena began reconnecting with old coworkers. People with whom she could laugh without explaining herself, with whom she could talk about herself without feeling ignored. Daniel, immersed in numbers, deadlines, and reports, no longer noticed the subtle changes in her behavior, the way she dressed differently for events, her evasive answers when he asked about her day, her lost gaze during dinner. He trusted her almost blindly, not out of naivete, but because he deeply believed that true love requires no vigilance. And it was precisely this trust, so sincere and calm, that would become his greatest pain. Helena, on the other hand, was immersed in internal conflict. She felt guilty for feeling what she felt, for wanting what she wanted, for allowing herself to dream of a different life. She still loved Daniel. But this love seemed to have transformed into something closer to gratitude than passion. She fondly remembered the moments they'd shared, their achievements together, the way he'd always been her safe haven. But at the same time, there was a longing within her for something new, a call for a kind of attention she no longer received, a desire to feel alive again. It was as if she'd been caught between two worlds, one she respected and one she desired. Despite this, she kept up appearances. She continued to arrive home on time, attend family dinners, laugh at the same jokes, and talk about the same topics. Daniel remained kind, caring, present in his own way. But she felt distant, disconnected, as if watching her own life from the outside. The kisses became formal, the hugs brief. And the glances, they no longer met as often. Still, there was affection. There was still memory. And perhaps that was why she hesitated so much before the abyss that was beginning to form between them. Meanwhile, Daniel continued investing in their future together. Working hard, making plans for a possible move, considering a longer trip, perhaps a return to Europe, a place they had both loved visiting years ago. In his mind, everything was fine. The difficult phase was just that, a phase. Something that would be overcome with time, with dedication. He believed in it strongly. The kind of belief born of someone who never had the slightest doubt that they were with the right person. And perhaps that's why he didn't notice that the right person was starting to drift away. It was at this point in the story that everything began to reconfigure itself. The setting, the intentions, the silences, the gestures, all subtle, all implicit. There was still no explicit pain. There were no confrontations. But there was a premonition of something. A slight tremor before the earthquake. An emptiness that crept between the lines of everyday life. A silent imbalance between two hearts that no longer beat in unison. It was as if history were about to turn a decisive page. But for now, everything continued as always, at least to those who only saw the surface. The week of the company party arrived with a symbolic force no one could have imagined. For Daniel, it represented just another social engagement, the kind you go to out of politeness, stay out of courtesy, and leave as soon as possible. For Helena, however, it was different. There was a sparkle in her eyes he hadn't seen in a while, an almost youthful excitement as she talked about the details of the event, the decorations, the musical group she'd hired, the guest list. She changed her outfit 3 times that afternoon, which was unusual. She spent too much time in front of the mirror, choosing between 2 pairs of earrings, as if each carried a decisive weight. Daniel observed her with a slight, silent curiosity, without arousing suspicion, without comment. He admired her beauty with the same naturalness with which he loved her, silently, with a light heart. To him, she was beautiful. But he didn't say so. And perhaps this was just another small silence among the many that had accumulated over the past few months. The arrival at the event was shrouded in formality. Greetings, camera flashes, glasses of sparkling wine passed between people. Helena soon loosened up. She moved with natural ease among the guests, distributing smiles, affectionate greetings, and side conversations. Daniel followed her with his eyes, without jealousy, just with the care of someone who knows the other person's gestures. He noticed how much more alive she seemed there than at home. And although it subtly bothered him, he preferred to interpret it as a passing moment. After all, everyone has better days than others. And if she was happy that night, good. That was what he thought as he poured himself another glass, chatted with close colleagues, and kept his body present, although his mind was already wandering with scattered thoughts. As the hours passed, Daniel lost sight of Helena. She wasn't in any of the usual conversation groups, nor near the dessert table, nor near the dance floor where some were taking awkward steps. Initially, he wasn't worried. He figured she might have gone to the bathroom or taken a call. But the minutes passed, and the discomfort came along with an intuition he couldn't explain. He walked to the back of the room, where the service exits were. And that's when he stopped. He stopped because he saw. And what he saw was more than enough to freeze time. Helena was leaving through a side door, a man at her side. He wasn't just any colleague. There was something about her posture, the lightness of her walk, the way she threw her head back as she laughed, that clashed with the formality of the event. She didn't look like a woman discreetly leaving a party. She looked like a teenager on the run, a newly discovered woman, someone breaking free from a prison only she knew existed. Daniel watched unseen. He felt his throat tighten. His hands sweated. The ground seemed to give way, but he remained there, as if something prevented him from moving. It wasn't just the sight of the scene, it was what she carried. This was more than a physical betrayal. It was confirmation that the estrangement he'd felt wasn't just an impression. It was real. It had a name. It had a body. It had laughter. He went back inside without thinking. He walked among the people like a ghost, hearing no sounds, feeling no touches, responding to greetings. He grabbed his coat, left his glass on the table, and walked out the front door. The night air felt like it was cutting into his skin. But he didn't cry. Not yet. Because there was a part of him that still hoped he was wrong. That still wanted to believe it was something else. A misunderstanding. A coincidence. A coincidence of gestures. He walked the streets with heavy steps, his heart too slow to be alive. And as the night faded into silence, he mentally replayed what he had seen, trying to find another explanation, any explanation, that would free him from the pain that was beginning to build within him. The following days were a rehearsal for what would become their new reality. Helena returned home late that night with the same smile she'd worn during the party. She feigned fatigue. She lay down beside him. She slept. Daniel didn't sleep. He lay with his eyes open for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how someone so close could become so distant. In the morning, she acted normally. She made coffee. She asked about his day. She spoke about the event enthusiastically, as if nothing had happened. Daniel listened to her with feigned attention, but his eyes were alert. She lied well. And he hated knowing it. It was a talent he hadn't seen in her. Or maybe he had, but he'd never needed to see it. He didn't confront her. Not yet. Something inside him wanted to observe more. He needed to understand the contours of what had happened. And, most importantly, he needed to decide if he really wanted to know how far it had all gone. During the days that followed, Daniel studied her like someone trying to read a book in another language. Every gesture, every word, every change of tone was a new chapter. And what he saw was the same pattern: care, normality, formal affection. But something was missing. Soul was missing. Helena seemed to be acting out a routine that had once been real. Her touch was too light, her words too sweet, her kiss too quick. It was as if she were trying to compensate for something. As if she carried within herself a secret so deep it could only be disguised with excessive affection. But Daniel wasn't stupid. And the pain he felt began to transform into clarity. He began to remember other nights when she hadn't arrived. Other coldly responded messages. Declined calls. Repeated apologies. He began to piece together the puzzle of distrust, fitting together pieces that had previously seemed loose, but now made all too much sense. Helena had someone. And he knew it with a certainty that hurt more than any physical proof. But still, he didn't accuse her. He waited. Then the weekend arrived. An informal invitation from the company for a more relaxed gathering among colleagues and family. Daniel, reluctantly, decided to go. He needed to see. He needed to be sure. They arrived together, as always. She smiled at everyone, he maintained a serene expression. But inside, every step she took, every glance they exchanged, was followed by Daniel's watchful eyes. And it was during a group chat that he realized. The man was there. The same one from the other night. And Helena's eyes searched his for a second longer than was acceptable. Daniel saw the glow, saw the subtle tremor in her hands, saw the change in her posture. And it was there, in that exact second, that everything was confirmed. The conversation ended, the group dispersed, and Daniel walked away. He walked toward the porch, feeling the wind blow on his face as if in a failed attempt to calm what was boiling inside. Helena followed him minutes later. She asked if he was okay, if he wanted to leave. He smiled. He said everything was fine. But inside, nothing was right anymore. And that night, for the first time, they slept in separate beds. A different silence settled between them. Not the comfortable silence of before, but an abysmal silence. Of people who could no longer be reached. The following Monday, Daniel came home early from work. He decided to open the box where they kept old documents. And there, among forgotten papers, he found something he hadn't expected. A letter. Hidden among envelopes. It was a letter he'd written years ago, never delivered. One of the many he'd written in moments of pure love, but which, through shyness or carelessness, had never been delivered. It was a long, sincere letter, with words that today seemed to be from another man. Helena didn't know about it. Or at least he thought she didn't. He put the letter back, unread. And something inside him told him the worst was yet to come. Betrayal was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. It was a wound. It was reality. But what Daniel didn't yet know was that the story didn't end there. Because there was one detail. A secret. A point yet to be revealed. And one that would change everything. That Saturday morning, Daniel woke before the sun, as he had for weeks. His body woke early, but his mind had already been awake for hours. He rose silently, crossed the hallway with heavy steps, and stopped in front of the bookshelf where, days before, he had found the letter. This time, he opened a different drawer. There they all were. More than a dozen letters he had written to Helena over the years, forgotten birthdays, difficult days, spontaneous declarations, attempts at reconnection. Letters he never delivered, but which he kept as records of a love that, he now knew, she never valued as she should have. But that morning, one was missing. The one I had found earlier. It was gone. He rummaged through the drawer, looked in the back of the box, on the side of the bookshelf, beneath the papers. Nothing. He felt a chill run down his spine. Someone had moved them. Helen had read them. He closed the drawer firmly. The dry sound of the wood fitting echoed through the still sleeping house. He took a deep breath, as if preparing for a swim. In the kitchen, the smell of coffee began to wade in, and Helena appeared, as she always did, her robe tied carelessly and her hair tied in a messy bun. She said something about the weather, mentioned they needed to buy more fruit, but Daniel didn't respond. He just stared at her. And in that look, there was everything that had never been said. She noticed. She fell silent. He sat at the table. He stared at the cup for a few seconds and then spoke. He said he knew. That he no longer needed to listen to explanations or half-truths. That he had seen enough, felt enough, understood enough. Helena tried to interrupt him, but he continued. He said he didn't feel anger, only pity. And sadness. Because what they had built deserved more than the silent end she imposed when she chose someone who wasn't part of their story. Helena took a deep breath. She brought her hands to her face for a moment, as if trying to contain something greater than her own will. She sat across from him and, for the first time in a long time, looked him in the eye without looking away. She said she never wanted things to get this way, that she hadn't planned anything, that she'd simply let herself be carried away by a feeling that, she now realized, was an illusion. She said she'd made a mistake, that she'd confused need with freedom, desire with affection. Daniel listened to her in silence, without interrupting. She spoke for long minutes, trying to justify what had no justification, trying to name feelings that no longer existed. And when she realized he wouldn't respond, she fell silent. It was then that, on impulse, she got up and left the room. She returned minutes later with the letter in her hands. The same letter he had written years ago and which, until then, she had thought was hidden. She clutched the envelope tightly, her eyes teary, her fingers trembling. She said she had found it by chance while searching for an old document. She had read the letter more than once, and that each word was like a punch in the gut. She had no idea how much he loved her, or rather, she did, but had forgotten. She said she cried while reading it, and that, in that moment, she wanted to go back in time. To ask forgiveness for every cold gesture, for every absence, for every time she chose to look outside instead of looking at him. Daniel was unmoved. His voice, when he spoke again, was firm but not aggressive. He said he didn't write those letters to be read too late. That each one was an attempt to keep alive a flame she herself extinguished every day. That there was no point in saying she regretted it now, when she had already crossed a line of no return. Helena cried. She really cried. But he wouldn't give in. Because there was a new limit within him. A limit of self-respect she never imagined existed. But then she revealed it. She said there was more. Something he didn't know. Something she'd hesitated to tell him for weeks, but now, faced with his silence, she needed to say. Not to justify herself, but because she couldn't bear it alone any longer. She took a deep breath and, with a choked voice, confessed, her lover disappeared. A few days after the last time they saw each other, he simply vanished. He cut off contact, blocked messages, changed departments within the company. But what devastated her wasn't the abandonment, it was what she discovered later. Suspicious, she investigated. She searched social media, talked to colleagues, and eventually found the man's wife. A simple, discreet woman, but with hard eyes, who knew everything. She knew from the beginning. And she let it happen. On purpose. The lover's wife said she saw Helena with him for the first time during a previous event. That she noticed the tension between them, the exchange of glances, the lopsided smiles. And that, instead of intervening, she decided to observe. Because, according to her, it was only a matter of time before everything revealed itself. And what's more, she said Helena wasn't the first. Nor the second. That her husband repeated the same pattern with other women, choosing precisely those who seemed emotionally fragile but socially respected. He said Helena fell into the trap out of vanity. And that now she would have to deal with the image she had created of herself. Before leaving, the lover's wife handed him an envelope. Inside were printed conversations between the two. Printouts. Photos. Records. Everything. Evidence. Details. Ironies. Including an exchange of messages in which the lover commented, laughing, that Helena seemed to have fallen too easily. Hearing this, Daniel clenched his fists. Not out of jealousy. Nor anger. But because he realized that everything he believed to be carelessness or emotional weakness had actually been a conscious choice. And a ridiculous one. Because she hadn't betrayed him out of love. She betrayed him out of vanity. Out of impulse. Out of boredom. And that hurt more than anything she'd seen that night. The physical betrayal now seemed smaller compared to the emotional betrayal, the contempt for what they'd shared. He got up from his chair. He walked to the bedroom. He picked up a small box where he kept some mementos, their first photo together, a movie ticket, a travel note. He put the letter back inside and calmly closed the lid. He returned to the living room. He told her she didn't need to explain herself further. That nothing I said would change the essence. And that, at that moment, the love he felt for her was no longer enough to keep him there. Helena tried to get closer. She touched his arm. She asked him to look at her. She told him that what she felt now was real. That the other man's abandonment had made her realize what truly mattered. Daniel then looked at her. But his gaze was no longer one of pain. It was one of clarity. He said he forgave. But not as an invitation back. He forgave because he was freeing himself. Because carrying the weight of that story was no longer his mission. Because it was no longer about her. It was about him. About the man he was becoming. She cried. She begged. She said she was sorry, that she would do everything differently. But he didn't answer. He grabbed his car keys, left the house, and left behind not just a woman, but a story. Because there, in that silent room, the cycle had ended. And, although he didn't know it yet, a new beginning was already waiting for him on the other side of the road. Daniel didn't go home that night. He drove aimlessly, without music, without rushing. He just let the silence of the car fill the space between him and everything he'd left behind. When he finally stopped, he was facing the sea. He couldn't explain how he'd gotten there, he just felt that this was where he belonged. He sat on the sand, kicked aside his shoes, and watched the waves come and go as if carrying fragments of thoughts he could no longer organize. There was no anger. There was no more pain. Just a kind of lucid emptiness, like someone who finishes a book and understands that no extra page can change the ending. He picked up his phone, stared at the lit screen for a few seconds, and then turned it off. He wanted distance from everything. He needed to understand who he was now, without her, without the us, without the daily rituals that had been his routine for so long. Meanwhile, Helena remained seated on the living room floor, amid scattered papers, dried tears, and the box he'd left open before leaving. He read the oldest letter again, the first one he found, and then one by one, like someone revisiting a past that now seemed too distant to touch. Each word Daniel wrote sounded like a scream she could only hear now, when everything was already falling apart. The memories of the days he'd waited for her awake, the notes left on her pillow, the hot coffees made in silence on cold days, all of it came back with the crushing weight of guilt. And what had once been a relationship erased by routine now came back to her with painful clarity. For the first time, she felt that no forgiveness could restore what she'd lost. And what hurt most was knowing he hadn't lost it by accident, but by choice. Daniel spent the next few days staying at a simple beachfront inn, without contact with anyone. He enjoyed the anonymity, the lack of obligations, the freedom of not having to explain himself. He walked every morning, jotted down stray thoughts in an old notebook, read excerpts from forgotten books, and little by little, something inside him began to reorganize. It wasn't happiness, but it wasn't suffering either. It was a kind of warm peace, like someone who accepts that certain things will never return and yet still finds beauty in what remains. One day, while drinking coffee on the inn's veranda, a woman asked permission to sit at the next table. He had a gentle smile and a calm gaze, and he leisurely struck up a conversation. He talked about the smell of the sea, the books stacked on the reception counter, and the simplicity of life. It was a light conversation, unintentional, but charged with presence. Daniel responded naturally and was surprised to realize she was truly listening, not just pretending to be there. When she got up and said goodbye, he didn't ask her name. But he remembered the way she smiled before turning her back and disappearing around the corner of the hallway. In the days that followed, they met again by chance. Small coincidences, but they always came with a strange sense of synchronicity. Her name was Laura. Her story was completely different from his, but there was something in her way of being that demanded nothing, didn't pressure, didn't invade. She just was. Daniel began to talk more, to laugh at things that previously wouldn't have drawn a breath from him, to talk about his mistakes and even about Helena, with surprising honesty. Laura didn't judge him, didn't advise him, she just listened. And there was a tenderness so rare in this that he began to understand that reconstruction wouldn't come from someone who completed him, but from someone who looked at him without wanting to fix him. Meanwhile, Helena sank into a silence no one around her could decipher. She tried to return to her routine, but everything seemed shallow. Her friends didn't know what to say, her family pretended not to notice Daniel's absence, and work no longer sparked her with the same enthusiasm. The messages she sent him remained unanswered. And each silence was a confirmation of what she already knew, time would not return. He began to frequent places they once frequented together, as if physical space could bring back an emotionally dead feeling. But nothing filled her. Because now, what hurt wasn't just his absence, but her own. She had lost herself, and in trying to find something outside of the relationship, she ended up destroying the only thing that was truly hers, her own story. One day, on impulse, she got in her car and drove to the sea. She felt he was there. She didn't know how, she just felt it. She stopped at inns, discreetly asking around, until a receptionist recognized the description. She said he was still staying there, but had gone for a walk. Helena sat on the wooden bench near the beach and waited. She didn't know what she would say, she had no rehearsed speeches, she just wanted to see him. She wanted to ask him to take one last look. When he appeared, walking toward the sea with slow steps and staring lost in the horizon, she felt her heart race. But she hesitated. And just watched. Minutes later, Laura appeared, walking toward him. She carried 2 bottles of water and a book in her hands. She handed them to him, smiled, and they sat side by side on the sand, silent, like two sharing something that doesn't need to be said. Helena watched from afar, and didn't need a word to understand. That man was no longer hers. She stood up, her eyes brimming with tears, got back in the car, and drove aimlessly. She cried uncontrollably for the first time. Not out of anger, nor wounded pride, but because she finally understood what she had done. And what she had lost. Later, Daniel received a message from her. Brief, sincere. I saw you today. The way they looked at you was beautiful. I just wanted to say that I understand everything now. And that even with all the pain, I wish you peace. He read the message and fell silent. He didn't respond. But he felt something settle inside him. It wasn't hurt. It was closure. He knew that from that moment on, their story would exist only as a memory. Not as a possibility. That same night, Daniel walked with Laura to a simple beachside restaurant. They sat at a table, ordered something light, and talked for hours. She asked him what he would write in a new letter, if he ever wrote again. He thought for a few seconds and replied that he would write to himself. I would say that there are no guarantees in life, that love is not enough if it's one-sided, and that trust is like glass, when it breaks, it can be put back together, but it will never be the same. I would say that sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself, and that some pains come to awaken parts that were sleeping. Laura smiled and said she hoped he would write, because there were people who needed to hear it. He replied that maybe he would. But this time, he wouldn't keep the letter. He would deliver it. By hand. Helena, in turn, returned home and opened the same box where Daniel kept his memories. But she found nothing but empty space. She now kept there the letters she herself had begun writing to him, even though she knew he would never read them. Not as a way to win her back, but as an attempt to understand everything that had happened. Writing was her only way to move on. Because the love she had lost wasn't just his. It was hers too. And now, she knew that her biggest mistake wasn't betrayal. It was letting love die without a fight. The days passed. Time, which doesn't heal everything but teaches us to live with each other, began to soften the wounds. Daniel left the inn and returned to the city, but with new plans, new habits, and a new outlook on everything. He met Laura again, unhurriedly, without expectations. And even though I didn't know where this would lead, I knew I was no longer trapped in the past. I could breathe. Helena also started over, little by little. She sought help, faced the stairs, rebuilt part of herself with what was left. Not to return to what she was, but to avoid repeating what she had been. And she would forever carry the weight of her choices. But also the lesson that only those who lose learn, that true love isn't found every day, and when it is, it should never be treated like a replaceable object. Because there's nothing more precious than what you only recognize when it's gone. Daniel continued his life unhurriedly, but with direction. The pain that once seemed deeply rooted now lingered like a distant echo, not because the past had been erased, but because he had learned to look at it without wanting to return. It was like a scar, still visible, still sensitive at times, but already part of what made him whole. The restart wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. There were days when he questioned whether he was ready to love again, whether he hadn't closed himself off more than he should have, whether this new feeling blossoming alongside Laura was truly genuine or merely an unconscious attempt to fill the gaps Helena had left. But her presence, always light, undemanding, allowed him to gradually build a new way of feeling, a new way of belonging. He didn't need to prove anything, nor justify himself, and this freedom brought to light a part of himself that had long been dormant. Laura didn't ask about the past more than necessary. She respected Daniel's silences with a rare wisdom. She knew that some pains don't need to be discussed, but rather understood in the other person's own time. And this gradually made him want to open up. Not out of obligation, but out of trust. He talked about the letters, about the years of their relationship, about the feeling of loss that came not only from betrayal, but from the shattering of a story so carefully constructed. He said he no longer blamed Helena for everything. That he now understood that love is a path that must be traveled by both sides. That he himself had lost himself amidst his attempts to hold on to what was falling apart, and that, although he didn't deserve the way things had happened, he had also failed to see the signs in time. Laura listened attentively. And in the end, she simply said she was happy he'd decided to stay, that the bravest thing to do wasn't to stay, it was to leave. And Daniel smiled, for the first time in a long time, with a full, unclouded smile. He then began to reorganize his life from the inside out. He sold the apartment where he'd lived with Helena, choosing a smaller, more cozy space with large windows and plenty of natural light. He resumed his habit of cooking, of listening to music that reminded him of who he was before he'd been just someone's husband. He rushed back in the morning, visiting bookstores, writing fragments of thoughts that might one day become something bigger. And late one afternoon, sitting at a cafe table, he wrote a letter in a suit. But this time, it wasn't to her, nor to himself. It was to no one. It was a letter to time. Thanking her for taking what no longer served and for leaving only what made sense. Helena, for her part, experienced silence differently. If before it had been a deafening noise, now it was a kind of punishment she accepted without resistance. She no longer tried to seek him out. She no longer apologized. She knew that everything that needed to be said had already been said. What remained was to learn to live with her own absence in the life of someone who had once been everything. She began attending therapy, looking inward with more honesty, recognizing that what she lost wasn't just a man, but a version of herself that only existed when she was with him. She tried to reconnect with old friends, seeking activities that made her feel something other than guilt, but there was always a gap, a brief moment between one gesture and the next, when the weight returned with force. And it was in those moments that she wrote. No longer to Daniel, but to herself. Diaries poured out in silence, confessions that sought not forgiveness, but understanding. One day, when Helena happened to run into a friend she hadn't seen in a long time, she heard something that made her stop. Her friend, unaware of the details of the separation, commented on how well Daniel seemed now. Lighter, more present, with a glow I hadn't seen in a long time. She said she'd seen him at a cultural event, smiling next to a serene-looking woman, and that she'd sensed something different about him. Helena simply smiled discreetly and, upon returning home, cried. Not because she wanted to be in the other woman's place, but because she realized Daniel had achieved what she hadn't been able to offer, peace. And there, amidst tears and silence, she understood that love doesn't always survive regret. That some losses are permanent. That no gesture can reverse the exact moment someone decides to move on without you. Meanwhile, Daniel was invited to speak at an engineering conference, and he took Laura with him. It was the first time he was introducing her to the world outside the safe bubble they had created together. During the event, many acquaintances greeted him enthusiastically, and some even asked him, naturally, about Helena. He responded calmly, without embarrassment. He said it had been an important story, but that he was now part of another stage. And everyone understood, perhaps because they saw in him a man who had not only overcome a separation, but had been reborn from it. Laura followed him from afar, proud, knowing that the right time had come. At the end of the event, during dinner with friends, Daniel was asked what he learned from everything he had experienced. He was silent for a moment and then replied that he had learned that love is a daily choice, and that the absence of choice is also a choice. He said that no one cheats out of the blue, but that nothing justifies cheating. That true love doesn't require perfection, but it does require presence. And that, above all, he learned that respecting yourself is the only way to one day truly respect another person. The words lingered, and everyone around understood that this wasn't a bitter lesson, but rather a cycle that had ended with dignity. Back in their new home, Daniel and Laura lived simple days. No movie romance, no exaggerated promises. Just two adults who chose to be there for each other, unhurried, unfearful, and untroubled. He still wrote, she still listened. And between one day and the next, between a laugh and a silent exchange of glances, life took on a new shape, a new truth. Helena continued alone, but not unhappy. She discovered that pain, when embraced, transforms. She began helping other women in the process of starting over, started an emotional support group, and used her own story as an example of what not to do, but also as proof that it is possible to rise again. She knew she would never erase what happened, but she also knew she could choose what to do with it. In the last letter she wrote, which she never sent, Helena said she understood that true forgiveness isn't the kind that rebuilds bridges, but the kind that allows each person to move on peacefully along different paths. She said she wished him all the happiness in the world, even if it wasn't by her side. And in that moment, as she closed the notebook and put it away in the drawer, she felt for the first time that something inside her was being released, too. Daniel, on the other side of town, was writing a new text for a project he was beginning to conceptualize. It wasn't about engineering. It was about life. About loss, new beginnings, choices. About what love demands and what it doesn't forgive. And as he wrote, he remembered it all, not with pain, but with respect. Because even stories that end badly leave lessons that help us write new beginnings. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most beautiful part of it all. In that early autumn, the sky took on a duller tone, the streets seemed to move at a different pace, and Daniel, for the first time in a long time, felt he no longer needed to rush anywhere. After months of trying to reorganize his own story, far from everything familiar, he decided it was time to face some scenarios he had avoided again. He returned to the old city to resolve legal matters regarding the inheritance with Helena. The lawyers had almost completed the paperwork, but there were still documents to be signed and a final face-to-face meeting between the two. And despite being emotionally distant, something inside him weighed heavily on that idea. Not out of doubt. But because he knew that this reunion, however brief, carried a symbolic value difficult to ignore, it would be the final point of everything they had experienced, now formalized on paper. A sealed end, with no return, but necessary. The law office was cold and silent. The assistant asked her to wait in the next room. As she absently leafed through an old magazine, she heard the door open. Helena entered silently. She wore a sober dress, her hair shorter than he remembered, and there was a serenity on her face that no longer carried pretense. She sat across the table, and for a few seconds, they avoided each other's eyes. Daniel was the first to break the silence, saying only that he wanted to resolve everything calmly. Helena nodded in agreement. The lawyer explained the final terms, asked a few questions, and answered technical queries. Everything was professional and restrained. But when the meeting ended, before they stood up, Helena spoke. Not hurriedly, not with exaggerated emotion, simply with firmness and honesty. She said she knew no apology would be enough to erase what she had caused. But she needed to say, for the last time, that she was deeply sorry not only for what she had done, but for the way she had devalued everything he was. That, over time, she had understood that the truest love wasn't the one that exploded in grand gestures, but the one that endured in the small details. She said that, in the last few months, she'd thought a lot about what it would have been like if she'd listened more, if she'd stopped looking so outward and paid more attention to his silence, which she now understood as unspoken pain. Daniel listened to everything with his eyes fixed on hers, but without holding any resentment. When she finished, he responded quietly but firmly, saying that forgiving didn't mean forgetting, and that he chose not to harbor hatred because resentment binds, but that it didn't undo what was destroyed. He said that, even though she now understood what she lost, he had already stopped recognizing himself in that story. That moving forward wasn't about erasing the past, but about respecting what you became after it. And that, sincerely, he hoped she, too, would find a way to be whole for herself, not for someone else. Helena simply nodded, her tears unshed. They clasped hands, and that was the last time they looked into each other's eyes. After leaving the office, Daniel walked aimlessly through the city streets. The storefronts looked exactly the same, the cafes still smelled the same, but nothing was the same. He passed the building where they had lived together and felt no urge to go in. Nor sadness. It was just a building now, not a home. He remembered the first time Helena had decorated that space with plants in the windows, and he also remembered the last time he had seen those plants, wilted and forgotten. Their story didn't die all at once, he knew that. It died in layers, like leaves falling from a tree at the end of its cycle. And perhaps their mistake was pretending the trunk was still strong even when the roots were no longer nourished by anything. That same night, back at his new apartment, Daniel prepared dinner while listening to a playlist Laura had created for him. Calm songs with clever lyrics and soft melodies. There was a strange feeling in the air, a mix of closure and new beginnings, of relief and reflection. When Laura arrived, the mood was different. She noticed. She asked if he was okay, and he replied yes, but that he had met Helena again that day. Laura didn't react with insecurity. She sat at the table, held his hand, and simply asked, "Did you manage to say what you needed to?" Daniel took a deep breath and said yes, but that the most important thing was what he didn't say, that now he knew he no longer needed answers. That peace came when one let go of the expectation of a perfect outcome. She smiled. And that night, he felt he had crossed, once and for all, the bridge between who he was and who he wanted to be. The following days brought a different calm. Daniel became more involved in social projects, revisited the idea of publishing his chronicles, and participated in events about relationships and self-discovery. He discovered that his story, painful as it was, could help others heal as well. He began to be invited to discussion groups, radio shows, and podcasts. And in each of his speeches, there was always the same starting point: the importance of not romanticizing emotional abandonment, the need for active presence in a relationship, and how much a wrong choice can ruin not only the other person, but also oneself. Meanwhile, Helena was silently rebuilding her life. There was no new relationship, and perhaps there wouldn't be for a while. First, she needed to rebuild herself as a woman, as a human being, as someone capable of loving maturely and responsibly. She dedicated herself to the support group she founded, listening to stories similar to hers, and each one hurt in its own way. She was confronted with difficult mirrors, but she also found solace in realizing she wasn't alone. One day, one of the women in the group said she had forgiven her husband and started over with him. Another said she had separated and could never trust anyone again. Each story was unique, and Helena learned to listen, to respect the times, and to observe herself in the process. She no longer cried like before. The pain became something else, a memory that she now used as a guide, not an anchor. Laura and Daniel traveled together for the first time 3 months later. They chose a simple destination, a village with cobblestone streets and small inns, far from the noise, close to nature. During the trip, she gave him a hardcover notebook. In it, he wrote on the first page, "For the stories yet to come." Daniel smiled sincerely. There, among tall trees, empty roads, and conversations under the starry sky, he understood that love could, indeed, be rediscovered. Not the same. Not better or worse. Just different, whole in its own way. And that the most valuable love is not the one that blinds us, but the one that allows us to see clearly even our own flaws. On the way back from his trip, Daniel passed by the old bookstore where he'd met Helena. The place was still there, now with a new coat of paint, different staff, and new stories being written every day. He didn't go in. But he stopped for a few seconds and looked in the window. He saw a couple arguing over which book to take. They laughed. They argued. And they left arm in arm. He smiled to himself. Life was made of this: encounters, misunderstandings, rebirths. And he finally felt free to continue writing the next chapters. Not to erase the previous ones, but to honor everything he'd learned from them. And even without knowing it, at that very moment, Helena was skimming through one of his columns in a literary magazine, unaware that he was the author. She read each line with the feeling that those words had already been spoken to her in another form, at another time. When she reached the end of the text, a quote was highlighted: "Love lost through carelessness always returns, but never to the one who lost it." She closed the magazine slowly. And for the first time, she accepted. Without anger. Without hope. She simply accepted. Because sometimes, the deepest form of love is letting go, even if it costs one's own heart. At the end of a year that felt like a decade, Daniel felt like he had finally made it through all his winters. He no longer carried the weight of the questions that once kept him awake, nor did his heart feel oppressed by the memories that once insisted on returning. Now, there was room. Room for new things, for feelings that didn't hurt, for the lightness of simply being himself, without the constant feeling of being left behind by someone he claimed to love but was always walking in another direction. Life had taken on new contours, as if time had reassembled the puzzle of his days, not with the same pieces, but with different, more honest images. And on that cloudy late afternoon, sitting in a corner cafe, watching the people outside, Daniel understood clearly that not all loss is tragedy, some are liberations disguised as pain. The week before, he had given a talk about emotional reconstruction after traumatic breakups. He told his story as naturally as he would a change of address. No anger, no self-pity. It was just the truth, expressed with the dignity of someone who had lived and survived. At the end, a woman in the audience approached silently, touched his arm, and said, with teary eyes, that hearing those words had prevented her divorce. She and her husband were estranged, and, according to her, it was due to mutual neglect. The talk made her want to try again. Daniel thanked him, smiled kindly, and, as he drove home that night, he realized his pain had created something good for someone. And that was enough. Laura was waiting for him with dinner ready, her hair tied up in a messy bun, and the same calm look that had welcomed him from the beginning. This was where he wanted to be, and now, he knew the feeling was mutual. Helena, on the other hand, lived her days in a discreet, almost invisible routine. She spent her mornings in the writing studio, helping other women transform their pain into words. In the afternoons, she worked on a therapeutic listening project for people who had betrayed someone and were seeking inner reconstruction. It was as if she were trying to rebalance the weight of what she had caused by helping others avoid repeating the same path. She no longer sought justification, no longer defended herself from judgment. She knew that many saw her as the villain of her own story. But she didn't see herself that way. She saw herself as someone who failed but decided not to remain fallen. She still loved Daniel, yes, but not with the same attachment as before. Love now came with acceptance, the realization that some decisions are final, and that learning to live with absence is also a sign of maturity. Occasional encounters with faces from the past still caused her some discomfort, but she faced each one with serenity. She no longer needed to justify herself to anyone, only to herself. One weekend, she was invited to a literary fair where one of her texts, written under a pseudonym, would be read by an actress. She sat among strangers and listened silently to every word she'd written during sleepless nights of reflection. When she finished, the audience gave her a standing ovation. No one knew it was hers, and it made her smile. It was a new kind of recognition. Anonymous, but genuine. For the first time, she felt proud of something born of pain but transformed into art. As she left the venue, she ran into a former coworker who mentioned seeing Daniel at an event a few days earlier. He said he was fine, that he seemed fulfilled. She simply nodded. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't seek details. She simply kept walking, with firm steps, as if she understood that there were places that were no longer hers. Meanwhile, Daniel and Laura were planning a small move. Nothing grand. They just wanted to trade their apartment for a house with a yard, where they could plant some trees and maybe get a dog. She said the dirt floor would keep them more connected to reality. He laughed, saying she spoke like a character in a book, but deep down he knew it was true. After living so much among ruins, all he wanted was solid ground. Among the moving boxes, he found one of the old letters he hadn't burned. He read it in silence. It was a letter to Helena, written long before the pain, when there was still hope that love would endure. When he finished, he tore the page into 4 pieces and threw it away. Not out of contempt, but because there was no point in keeping it. The story needed to stay in the past so that the present could truly have space. In the new house, the first late afternoon arrived with a light rain and the smell of wet earth. Laura appeared with 2 glasses of wine and suggested they put on some old music. Daniel looked around, saw the bare walls, the stacked furniture, the books still in their boxes. And yet, he felt at home. He took her hand and they danced right there, in the empty living room, amidst quiet laughter and unspoken promises. It was a different kind of love. It needed no vows, no perfect settings. It was love because it was simple, because it was true. And he knew that now, he no longer needed to prove himself worthy of anything. Just be. A few months later, Daniel published his first book, a collection of chronicles about new beginnings, growing up, and difficult choices. Helena read it in silence, one morning, by the dim light of the lamp, her heart torn between admiration and regret. On one page, he wrote, "Love that leaves through carelessness returns as a lesson. And lessons, when learned, set us free." She closed the book and, for the first time, wept peacefully. Not because she wanted to start over, but because she understood that the pain had become wisdom. And that, perhaps, was enough. And so, each went their own way. Daniel found the peace he sought in another embrace. Helena found her own redemption within herself. And time, ever wise, took care of putting everything in its place. Because some stories don't need reconciliation to have a beautiful ending. Sometimes, what redeems is precisely separation. The ending that hurts, but teaches. The absence that liberates. The love that doesn't resist, but transforms. And now that you've made it this far, tell me in the comments what you thought of this story. What touched you most? What would you do in each character's shoes? I want to hear your thoughts. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories like this, real, intense, and thought-provoking stories. The truth is that betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys trust, identity, dreams, memories. It tears apart families, erodes friendships, and silences affection. And often, when someone finally understands the damage they've caused, it's already too late. Therefore, never underestimate the value of true love. Never treat with care what was built with care. Because love, when it leaves, takes pieces that we can't always repair. And remember, this channel does not support, normalize or romanticize any type of betrayal. Here, the truth is told to open the eyes, not to deceive the feelings. Until the next story.